Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Back with us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and our topic that we're going to be discussing is growth and body condition of calves fed different levels of milk replacer. Before we get into today's session, a reminder that if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. Well, welcome, Dr. Kurt. Great to have you back with us today.
Good to be back again with the weather warming up a little bit now.
Oh, I know. They say though spring isn't necessarily here quite yet, but it's
Right.
quite nice out and we're going to take whatever we can get, that's for sure. And I hope
Yeah.
those storms aren't coming through too severely down in St. Louis where you're at this I think this
There's,
Friday we're supposed to
yeah,
see some
tomorrow night.
some
Yeah.
things coming through. So, but let's talk about calf nutrition here. What do you have for us today?
Well, this is a study that's fairly detailed and was done at University of Illinois a number of years ago. But before we go into it, I want to give a little background about growth and body composition. And that really came together for me when I was at Cornell, and my professor, JT Tom Reed, actually, he published a classic review in 1955, I'm sorry, 1955. And it's still a good key review in this area. So they established some key elements. First is there's an inverse relationship between body water and fat. So when fattening occurs, it displaces water in the body. The second one is the percentage of water, protein, and mineral approaches a constancy in the fat-free body mass of animals at maturity, and that was called chemical maturity. The third one is carbohydrates only account for less than about a half of a percent of the body, so that's not much of a factor. And then age is highly correlated with the percent of fat-free body composition, and it tends to be a curvilinear relationship because as animals and we get older, we lose muscle mass, we lose some bone density. So those are some of the key principles, and I actually got very involved in that starting when I was at the University of Missouri because their classic studies were done in the 1910s and the 1930s by Henry Waters and Frank B. Mumford. And actually, there's two buildings, classroom or buildings on campus named in their honor. Then Sam Brody did his prodigious work that resulted in his 1945 book, Bioenergetics and Growth. And we're not going to get into that because that's quite an epistle. But what happened because of that background, there was a symposium organized by the National Academy of Sciences in 1967. And my future professor, Tom Reed, was an organizer and made a major presentation. And so that's when I met him, and that's how we got connected in this area. Then, when I got to Cornell, we got involved in a very detailed study. It was a culmination of quite a few previous studies. We had two breeds, dairy breed, Holstein, and Angus beef breed. We had bulls, steers, and heifers. We had two levels of intake and one single diet. And we had different points of slaughter. We had a baseline at 400 pounds, and then a 600 pound, and an 800, and 1,000 pound. And we measured completely everything. We did half of the carcass was ground up, and for proximate analysis, the other half was physically dissected into muscle, fat, and bone. And I did some key specialized assays looking at the RNA and DNA in some of the major muscle groups, lipogenesis in some of the major fat tissues, and growth hormone and insulin. And you can find those references in this article at the end. So this was the background that I came with when I finished graduate school and started work at Purina. And that's really how I got involved in understanding more about calf and heifer growth, as well as the body changes during lactation and the dry period of cows. So at the Illinois study was done where they had male calves and they were purchased from an Illinois dealer, and they were about a week of age. You never know for sure exactly. And they were delivered in 3 different shifts: May 27th, July 22nd, September 17, and 1999. And they were housed in hutches without bedding so that there would not be any confounding effect of eating bedding. And then they were fed whole unsaleable milk at 10% of body weight. And then we remained on this diet for 14 days, kind of an adjustment, standardization period. Water was available all times, but there was no calf starter fed because they really want to get a direct measure of the milk replacer and its feeding program. So I've got a full page of the various details about how they measured the body composition and the like. I'm not going to go into that detail, but I put it there so that you can find it easily without having to go back to the article itself. What they had was 3 levels of feeding. They were going to feed a milk replacer at 1.25% of its body weight, one group, 1.75% another group, and then 2.25% in the third group. And those were adjusted weekly. And there were 6 calves per treatment, male calves. And then at the very end, there was 8 in that particular group, the 2.25% group. The milk replacer was about a 25 protein, 19% fat. And it was fed at these levels adjusted weekly. And then there was a baseline slaughter group. And then at the end, they had a slaughter group. So that's, in simple terms, that's the way this study was done. So now let's look at some of the data. In the first table, we see that the dry matter feeding rate was a bit higher than projected. So instead of 1.25% of body weight, it was 1.44, 2.18 instead of 1.75, and 2.82 instead of 2.25. And then the actual amount of protein consumed, of course, increased with the feeding rates. Added the lactose from the milk replacer, which was about half lactose. The fatty acids, same thing, increased linear. And the calculated growth energy increased, as did metabolizable energy. Now let's look in table 2 at some of the actual data. The initial body weight was very similar, 101 pounds, and keep in mind these are male calves, so about a week old, so that's typical for Holstein calves. A little bit higher on the 2.25% feeding group. The final body weights reflected the daily gains: 0.8 pounds, 1.25% feeding rate, 1.54 pounds on the 1.75% feeding rate, and then 2.27 at the 2.25% feeding rate. Now, let's look at those body weights for a minute. 0.8 of a gram would be too low. We would not want that. But 1.5 pounds per daily gain, for most cases for female calves, that will double their birth weight at the end of 2 months. So that's a good happy medium feeding rate in this particular study. Whereas when you get to 2.27 pounds daily gain, that's a bit of a red flag. And that's because you may recognize that 2.2 pounds is basically a kilogram. And there are various studies been done with beef cattle and growing dairy heifers that show that when you get to that point and above, you've maximized protein deposition. So anything above that rate of gain a higher rate of gain is going to be primarily fat deposition. And that could be undue or unwanted degree of fat deposition. So let's keep that in mind. Now, when you look at the heart girth, there was some increase. Heart girth, body length, and both of those were linear increases, statistically significant. However, wither heights was not. You see 33.3, 34.0, 33.7. That's not too surprising because from studies I've done and reported on before, wither height increases about 2 inches per month for each of the first 6 months. So in this case, we wouldn't expect quite 2 inches or so. And so that's a small increase. So there can be enough variation from animal to animal or even in the measurement that those were not significant. So now let's look at the next table. This is the actual body composition of the empty body weight. So that's taking out the offal, any gut contents and that sort of thing. So the final composition, notice there's a 74.4% water in a baseline, and then that decreased 72.7, 71.0, 70.8. If you remember, one of the key principles was there's an inverse relationship between fattening and water composition. So if we look at protein, it was pretty even. So the higher feeding rate did not really increase the protein percentage in the body. And that goes back to the rate of gain, where when we get up to about 2.2 pounds, there's really not any benefit going beyond that because you're going to get primarily fattening. Now look at the fat though. 3.7% went to 5% at the 1.25% feeding rate, 6.5 and 7.5. So those are not too bad for young calves. But notice there's a linear increase in the fat as the milk replacer increased. And that is the inverse because of the linear decrease in the water composition. Now, if you look at the ash, there's not much difference there as well. And the energy in terms of megacals or kilogram of empty body weight, there's some increase there because that's going to be reflected in the fat content. So there we see, and then there were some other measurements done as well. They did some blood measurements, and they found that glucose, insulin, and IGF-1 all increase linear with the increasing feeding level. And that's not too surprising because IGF-1 is kind of a coordinating metabolic activity, and it coordinates the growth and the composition of the body. So I want to reference another study, though, that's been done because we talked about this increased fat deposition, and that was done at Cornell in the, I think it was had the same protein level milk replacer. No calf starter was fed, again, not to confound the study. And they increased the fat from 15% to 31% in the milk replacer, keeping protein level and trying to achieve about 1.3 pounds of growth. And when they did that, they found that the body fat increased from 15% in the milk replacer, resulted in 8.5% fat in the body. And at 31% in the milk replacer, it resulted in 11%. So you see those levels are higher than the levels in this study. the lowest in that study was 8.5%. And in this study, the highest was 7.5% fat. So that's an important concept to keep in mind whenever you're growing calves at a young age, is you don't want them to fatten. It's normal to have some fat increase, which should occur, and that will be at the expense of displacing water. So that's the result of this study in reference to some other studies in the principles of body composition growth.
Very good. So as we always like to ask, what would you say is your bottom line in all of this, Al?
The bottom line is, in this particular study, the middle feeding rate of the milk replacer was the best one, where you want to have an objective, especially for female calves, that you double their birth weight at the end of 60 days of life. And if you have about 1.5 pound daily gain times 60, that's 90 pounds. And most female calves are going to be around that 90-pound range. So you would double their birth rate. And then you would have some fattening with that. But if you go up to about a kilogram or 2.2 pounds a day, then that's when you're going to have a problem where you're on the verge of fattening, and you don't want to be in that territory if you can avoid it.
Very good. A reminder that you can read Al's column at feedstuffs.com. It's also posted there in the chat, or you get our digital edition of Feedstuffs that's coming out shortly. You can also read it there and view this video there as well. So, Dr. Kertz, thank you again for joining us today.
All right. See you next month.
All right. We'll see you next month. And thank you all for tuning in as well. All Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.